next up, we have Andrew Liu.
Yeah, so I don't have slides. I'm just going to discuss about my paper, and talk about really the thought process that went through writing the paper, the ideas that I try to convey behind the paper. So just going to briefly talk through it. The topic around my paper was on creative destruction. And I guess for those who aren't as familiar, creative destruction is this idea in economics that was coined by this Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who said that within our economies, there is this everlasting cycle where there are new innovations within the economy, new ways of doing things, new products, and new processes, right? But all of these new innovations come at the expense of the old ways of doing things, the old products and the old processes. So he claims that there really can't be progress without some sort of destruction of the past ways of doing things, of making those ways not popular anymore. And I think that's definitely one of a really interesting idea, because it seems very paradoxical, right? The fact that we can't really progress further without sort of looking at the past and kind of just not using the products and the processes that we had in the past. And I guess a big example to illustrate this point, I live in Vancouver, and I think up until a few years ago, we didn't have Uber or Lyft. And the reason behind that was because the taxi association here kind of boycotted the arrival of Uber and Lyft, because they understood that the arrival of Uber and Lyft meant that it was going to harm the taxi industry, right? There was going to be more competition, and they knew that Uber was going to get more popular, and eventually it would lead to the destruction of the taxi industry. So I think there are lots of prominent examples in society today of creative destruction having practical applications. But I think in my paper, I attempted to explore some of the applications within the pandemic world. So the main idea was that there are examples of creative destruction happening within the COVID-19 society, and there are two main types of creative destruction that I try to characterize within the essay. First being the examples of creative destruction that happened during the pandemic, and second, of the pandemic sort of the term I used in my essay was accelerating the process of creative destruction. So in the first example, I think there are more obscure. These are more obscure examples, more, I guess, less well known, because to be honest, 90% of creative destruction happening in the pandemic were because they started before the pandemic, and they were accelerated during the pandemic. So things such as, in the first category, I know that Sean brought up AI chatbots. So these are new inventions that are sort of here to replace, the conventional in-person receptionist coordinators and ways of, moving the medical field forward. So they had this new invention that, made it more efficient, and it kind of will fill a gap in the industry. So these are some of the new inventions. But I also know I read a few papers. It's kind of hard to find papers when the pandemic's still going on, but I know there was a paper on virtual tourism. So I know lots of countries rely on tourism as a source of income for a lot of the families in those areas. So an alternative that they made was using online platforms to try to cater to the same audience. So they brought, they used 3D technology, or they used VR technology to try to bring tourism to the same audience to make sure that they're still able to make a living. So these are some of the more, I guess, nuanced examples of creative destruction in a way that it's there to fill a gap. It's there to replace something that was there before. But I think 90% of the cases were under the other category that I tried to explain, which is the fact that the pandemic really only accelerated the rate at which creative destruction happened, because a lot of the inventions that we had were started before the pandemic. So the big example that I tried to talk about was Amazon or Alibaba. So these are online retail stores that started before the pandemic, but because of the pandemic, they became more popular, right? Because everyone was stuck in their homes, they couldn't go outside, all the malls and shops were closed. So the only other alternative was to shop online. And that's why a lot of these big stores grew bigger and they exploded, right? So I would say that they weren't invented, they weren't created during the pandemic, but the pandemic only made that process faster. They only made it faster for, in-store, like the retail industry to fall faster. It only made the online retail industry grow faster. So under the second example, I tried to characterize a lot of, those cases. Another big example, I would say, Uber Eats or DoorDash. So we know that a lot of the in-person dining services are, obsolete now because they've shut down. But at the same time, restaurants need to make money. People still need to make a living. So the other alternative is you have these services. They provide these new services. Well, they still existed before the pandemic, but they only grew bigger because of the pandemic. And these services, got really big and they helped our economy. So that was really what I wanted to characterize, the fact that there are different examples of creative destruction within our society, and they're applied different ways because of the pandemic. And I think the last thing I want to say is that just because there's, the fall of many industries, a lot of industries aren't doing well, people are losing their jobs, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. So a lot of the papers talk about how creative destruction is intrinsic to different economies that are healthy, right? It's an innate part of our society and of our economy. So I just want to say that even though there is a lot of bad things that are happening today, what it means is that it's kind of pushing us forward to, rely on these technologies more. It's pushing us basically in a direction that's more advanced for our society.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So let's again begin with Tom's comments.
Yeah, thanks. I found this really thought-provoking. So in the UK, I particularly noticed this trend, that there's been a lot of big high street shops that were already in trouble, and then the pandemic has just accelerated their demise, right? So it's not quite true to say that they closed because of the pandemic. They were going to close anyway, and it's just accelerated it. But I think the points you raise provoke quite a lot of ethical questions. So on the one hand, we've got the fact that all the people who work for these companies have lost their jobs and so on. That's a bad thing. On the other hand, we have this kind of accelerated progress that you talk about, and that's a good thing. From the way you argue, it seems like you say the good thing is bigger than the bad thing, right? That overall it's for the best. So I'm wondering if you could say more to justify that, because, for all the people who've lost their jobs, it doesn't seem that way. So, yeah.
Okay, so I think I would probably characterize it a little differently, where the alternative is more damage. So I think what we're actually looking at is the difference between a lot of damage and like less damage, because I think creative destruction, the way you should characterize it is, it's kind of, I think, offsetting some of the economic damage that's being done. So without, the new innovative ways that people are trying to make a living, there would be more people that don't have jobs. There will be more people that, can't make a living and can't survive. So I think I wouldn't necessarily say that, it's a really good situation. A lot of people are dying and a lot of people are losing their jobs. But I think it's just that creative destruction is a mechanism for, some progress being made in the time where a lot of things are like really bad.
Thanks.
Hande?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm gonna echo Tom. I thought it was very thought-provoking as well. What I was thinking about is what kind of relationship you think there is with the economic changes you're outlining and political ideologies. So do you think there's any impact of potentially changing political ideologies on the economic developments you're suggesting, or the other way around? So what kind of links are you seeing there?
So in terms of, the link between the fact that there's this destruction that's happening and political, I wouldn't say it caters to a specific ideology. I would say that if you know that there are new developments, and I guess it really depends on the political scene in the places around the world. If politicians or specific groups are able to maybe capitalize on the fact that there are these new developments, then I think that's something that would be really strong in time like this, because there isn't much that can be done in these times. There isn't really one right decision, but I think if no matter what political ideology, if you're able to capitalize on the fact that you can still have innovation in this time, you're still able to make progress in this time, I think that's the real link between that. I wouldn't say there is really a link between a specific ideology.
Thank you.
And Danielle?
Thank you for the interesting presentation, and I found it interesting and optimistic in one sense. I'll tell you why, because surely, especially the literature of the 90s, so you also mentioned and read Aghion and Owitt's paper, took this very optimistic view on the idea of creative destruction. But if we go to Schumpeter himself, and even before him, probably the first economist to introduce this idea, even without naming that way, was Marx. The idea of this process of creative destruction was thought as unsustainable. And actually, Marx thought that it would eventually lead to the collapse of capitalism, which did not happen, for the bad or for the worse, or for the good, I don't know. How can you reconcile? So can you take also a pessimistic view of creative destruction? Can you think that it can be unsustainable in the long term?
Well, I would say that the values that it breeds isn't as they're not that positive. So the fact that if people know that the next innovation is able to topple over billion-dollar companies, and that we can have more competition. I know that competition is healthy, right, in a capitalist economy. How it breeds better services, better products, for the consumers. But I think if everyone has this mindset that their next invention is going to make them a lot of money, or their next invention is going to replace this other industry, I don't necessarily think that's the best mindset to have in the 21st century. I think we should be collaborating on what we have so far. It shouldn't just be focused mostly on monetary gains. But I think back to the pandemic, it's okay. And at this point, I think we have different, we need to be focusing on different things. So I guess right now it's okay in the short term, but definitely in the long term, if we continue this mindset, it wouldn't necessarily be the best thing.
Thank you.
And thoughts from other students?
I have something, if that's all right.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
in your example, you mentioned a lot of already large corporations that seem to be benefiting from this, like Amazon and Uber Eats, things that are already able to transfer to a large online platform. But what about smaller businesses, ones that can't afford to go to an online thing, or something that COVID is forcing them to transfer to? How do you think that this would affect them? Do you think it would further kind of accentuate a wealth gap or anything?
I think that's sort of basic, how the economy works, right? Large businesses do have more money to develop their technology. They're able to adapt better. They're able to survive better in this environment. So I think definitely they're able to survive better. But in terms of the examples, so there's Amazon, Uber Eats, they do support local companies, and for example, Uber Eats, it supports local restaurants. Amazon, it's you're selling products from maybe from small businesses, maybe from large corporations. So I think in terms of those examples, it's sort of it's kind of helping everyone. But I definitely in the long term, if you're talking about creative destruction in general, I think large corporations do have an advantage. It does make it so that they're able to, innovate better, they're able to adapt better. So I do agree. I do think that's what's happening.
Seon?
I also had a question about, like, you mentioned how people are like losing jobs because of this creative destruction, and like, were there any solutions that you read or that you could think of to kind of like deal with those difficulties?
I think some of the papers mostly talk about, they didn't really characterize it as losing jobs, they characterize it as job reallocation, where people are losing jobs, but then other jobs are being created even more. So I think the solution is kind of inherent to the cycle itself. If we're not saying that, overall people are losing jobs, it's kind of like losing jobs, but then you're also creating new opportunities and new jobs. So I think overall, like, this is kind of a trend in general. Like, there are jobs being replaced by technology, or there are jobs that there are more and more jobs that require you to have like to be competent for the job, to have education. So I think the general trend is just that it's kind of bleak, but it's becoming more and more competitive. And I think that you need to be more like, in one sense, there are going to be new job opportunities, but at the same time, you need to be more qualified. You need to be more educated. And I think that's how you survive in that competitive environment.
Yeah, so Andrew, I just wanted to say the way I understood your paper was sort of Danielle and was touching on sort of the optimism that you were expressing. And when I read it, it was very much contextualized by a lot of the news that we get, which is about the unemployment and about sort of just this one side of things. So by sort of setting it against that background, that was what sort of struck me, especially by about your essay, sort of injecting a little bit of optimism into this background debate of unemployment and economic downturn. So I thought it was a really insightful and interesting piece. And thank you so much for your presentation, Andrew. A big round of virtual applause.